When you look at the world right now, it feels like everything is shifting at once. The United States is struggling, sometimes awkwardly, to maintain a rules-based international order that appears increasingly fragile. Europe is rearming at a pace unseen in decades, and China is asserting itself with a level of ambition that wasn't present a generation ago. Zoom out far enough, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. Two fundamentally different worldviews are colliding, not in a sudden explosion, but in a slow, grinding confrontation that stretches across continents. This moment is not random, it is not chaos, it is the predictable outcome of historical forces that began long before today's leaders were born. And if you trace those forces back through time, a clearer picture of the world emerges, one shaped by two incompatible visions of how human societies should be organized. According to historian Sarah Payne, there are fundamentally two different visions for how the world should work, and they're not compatible.
We talk about rights. In Chinese civilization, which is based on the Han ethnic group,
one is universal and rules-based. The other is hierarchical and civilization-based. This single insight, simple on the surface, unlocks almost every major geopolitical tension we see today. The dispute over Taiwan, the militarization of the South China Sea, the anxiety inside Europe, the competing strategies across Asia and Africa, all of them are expressions of this deeper clash. To understand why these visions exist, you have to look back not just decades, but centuries. Western civilization developed out of Greek analytical reasoning, Roman law, and Christian ideas about individual worth. Whether one is religious or not is irrelevant. What matters is the structure of thought these traditions implanted in Western institutions. Individuals are seen as rights-bearing units. Courts and contracts exist to protect those rights. Governments, ideally, serve their citizens, not the other way around. As Payne observes,
the individual has a soul, and the soul precedes governments.
This is the foundational logic behind liberal democracy, human rights, and the modern rules-based order. China, however, was shaped by a radically different path. While Europe developed through fragmentation, dozens of competing states locked in constant rivalry, China spent millennia battling internal wars on a scale the West rarely approached. Dynasties rose and fell amid chaos, famine, invasion, and uprisings. The trauma of those cycles forged a worldview in which chaos is the ultimate enemy and order is the highest good. Unity is not one political choice among many, it is a civilizational imperative. This is why Chinese political thought emphasizes hierarchy and obligations rather than individual rights. Where Westerners talk about rights, the Chinese talk about obligations. Where the West focuses on individuals, China focuses on groups. In this model, stability flows from a strong center, fragmentation is disaster. Once these civilizational instincts are understood, the modern behavior of the Chinese state becomes far easier to interpret. For decades, Western policymakers assumed that China's economic rise would naturally lead it to adopt the norms of the global system. China would get richer, integrate into the international economy, and eventually embrace openness and predictability. And indeed, China's transformation under Deng Xiaoping looked, for a time, like a triumph of this assumption. Economic reform lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. China became a manufacturing superpower. Its cities exploded with growth. On the surface, it seemed like a rising power willingly joining a global system that rewarded cooperation. But the Communist Party never intended to relinquish political control. The economic opening was not a step toward liberalization. It was a calculated strategy to build national strength while preserving one-party rule. This context makes Xi Jinping's leadership far more comprehensible. His consolidation of power, the anti-corruption campaigns, the crackdown on tech giants, the dismantling of Hong Kong's autonomy, the surveillance state, and the repression in Xinjiang are all part of the same logic, eliminate any alternative centers of power before they become threats. Xi's worldview was heavily shaped by the Soviet collapse. Payne highlights that Xi studied this moment intensely, concluding that the fatal Soviet mistake was political openness.
He learned political reforms before economic reforms. That was a disaster.
In his mind, Glasnost was not a bold democratic experiment, it was the final trigger of collapse. The consequences of this mindset ripple through China today. When dissent is crushed, innovation withers. When loyalty is prioritized over competence, growth slows. When power becomes hypercentralized, a nation may look strong on the outside, but becomes more brittle internally. Payne describes modern China as increasingly repressive, less dynamic, and more reliant on nationalism as a substitute for economic momentum. This internal tightening pushes China outward. When domestic pressure builds, rising powers often shift focus to external ambitions, and nowhere is that shift more visible or more dangerous than in the case of Taiwan. On a map, Taiwan is small, but geopolitically, it is one of the most consequential places on Earth. For the Western world, Taiwan is a symbol of democratic self-determination, a strategic anchor in the first island chain, and the heart of the global semiconductor industry. For China, Taiwan represents unfinished historical business, the final step toward national rejuvenation, and a repudiation of what Beijing views as the chaos of a divided Chinese world. Payne is direct about the stakes.
Xi Jinping is hell-bent on taking Taiwan. It'll be a disaster, most particularly for the Chinese.
This runs counter to the narratives often heard in Western debate. Many view an invasion as a nightmare for the United States or for global democracy, which it would be, but the deeper tragedy would unfold inside China itself. Taiwan produces the most advanced semiconductors in the world. These chips power everything from smartphones to fighter jets. A war would devastate global supply chains. Markets would collapse. Shipping routes would choke, and while every economy would be hit hard, China would suffer the most severe blow. Its export-driven model, its currency stability, and its investor confidence would be shattered. Much of the smart money has already begun quietly moving out of China, not because war is certain, but because the political environment has become unpredictable. Beyond economics lies the problem of political psychology. China's current leadership class has not lived through major war. They did not fight in Korea. They did not endure the Chinese Civil War. They were not shaped by the existential trauma that tempered earlier generations. Wars are easy to start and almost impossible to stop. Leaders without scar tissue often convince themselves that conflict will be short, manageable, decisive. History repeatedly proves them wrong. If Taiwan represents the front line of this emerging global divide, Europe represents the backbone that will determine how the world responds. For years, there has been a reflexive tendency to underestimate Europe, portraying it as slow, divided, bureaucratic. But this narrative misses something crucial about how power is built in democratic societies. Europe's strength comes not from speed, but from density, a dense web of institutions, treaties, norms, and cooperative mechanisms that make war between its members nearly unthinkable. Payne emphasizes a forgotten truth.
And particularly Europe. The Cold War was not won because what the United States did or didn't do.
And today, Europe is again playing a decisive role. Putin's invasion of Ukraine, intended to fracture the continent, instead triggered a historic surge in unity. Germany reversed decades of energy dependence. Nordic countries joined alliances they once resisted. Eastern Europe became more coordinated than at any other time since the fall of communism. Putin has boomeranged his own grand strategy. He's pushed Europe closer together. Zoomed out, the world is increasingly defined by two competing models of order. The first, favored by Russia and China, is a world of spheres of influence, where powerful states dominate their neighbors and where seas become territorial zones. The second, rooted in the Western tradition, is a universal rules-based system, where even large powers accept constraints and where the oceans serve as connective tissue rather than barriers. These two visions cannot coexist indefinitely without friction. You cannot stop another country from making a catastrophic decision. You can only raise the cost of it. The future of global order depends not on the whims of a single leader, but on the collective choices of societies, choices about alliances, institutions, values, and the kinds of systems we are willing to defend. History does not move automatically. It moves because people push it. And right now, the direction of that push will shape the world for decades to come.